Edition of the Toby Talks podcast. This is a conversation with Dr. Mathew Berg, who is a historian at John Carroll University in the history department. He specializes in 20th century Europe, the conflict of the 20th century in Europe, and genocide. We have a conversation about what is a genocide, what are the genocides of the 20th century. We go through the Armenian Genocide, we talk about Nazi Germany, we talk about a bunch of other things, the psychology behind a genocide. We talk about if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be considered a genocide. So, very intellectual conversation. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Berg, and I want to thank him for his time. It was an excellent conversation, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience will too. Without further ado, I'll leave you guys with the podcast, but before that, if you could like and subscribe, I would be eternally grateful to that. I put a lot of time into this, a lot of hours, so I appreciate you just clicking that like button and that subscribe button. Without further ado, here's Dr. Mathew Berg.
Dr. Berg, I want to thank you for joining the podcast. I'm really excited for this conversation. I thought we could start off maybe explaining who you are and your expertise.
Thank you for the invitation, Toby. So I'm Matt Berg. I'm a professor of history. I've been at John Carroll since the mid-90s. And my area of specialization is sort of starting broadly and working more narrowly, modern Europe. Mm-hmm. My research is in 20th century German-speaking Europe. Mm-hmm. And my interests are the sources of conflict and the social experience of conflict and how societies emerge from conflict, whether they're interstate wars or whether they're civil wars. Mm. So, embedded in all that can be the problem of genocide, certainly issues of human rights integrity, human rights violations, state building, political culture, and so on.
So, a lot of this stuff, when I was walking over here, something that I was thinking about is, that's some pretty heavy stuff that you kind of study. Does it ever, for me personally, I was kind of trying to put myself in that situation where that's what my expertise in my studies are, and kind of studying human behavior in those aspects. Does it ever make you feel more pessimistic or cynical about human beings?
I don't know. I've been asked that question before, and it's a tough one to answer. There's certainly times when maybe what you're discussing with students weighs on everybody a little bit more than others, depending how students relate to readings and themes you're discussing in a seminar, the way students are reacting to something that's going on in the world that they're seeing, sort of historical roots of. Mm-hmm. It's less the case with my own research because it's, I'm approaching it in a different way than I would be if I'm interacting with students.
I see. I gotcha. So throughout these conflicts, something, probably one of the most brutal things that could happen is genocide. Could you maybe define what a genocide is?
Sure. I've got a cheat sheet, and I made one for you too.
It's awesome.
So for the viewers or listeners, what we have here is the text from the United Nations Convention on Genocide that was drafted by the end of 1948. It didn't enter into force until 1951 when critical mass of states signed on. So I'll read what I've highlighted in yellow for the benefit of listeners. So the definition, according to Article 2, is for genocide is it means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and they include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And I'd pause here before we go to Article 3 to emphasize that it's very important in the framework of international law, in the eyes of the framers of the resolution, and the state reps that voted on it, that intent is underscored. These things can happen and they can happen on a large scale, but without discernible intent that would pass, the international prosecutors acid test. They might be looked at as other things like war crimes or crimes against humanity.
I got it.
Which are very serious things in their own right.
Very.
Genocide coming out of World War II, which is, where this document has its grim inspiration, if you like, had genocide very much on its mind with these elements to it.
Yeah.
So genocide came to be understood as the crime of crimes, but I think it's important that we appreciate that if charges of war crimes or crimes against humanity are brought up against an actor, and that person is convicted, we're talking about the potential for incarceration for as long a period, perhaps, as there would be for genocide. It's a label that's freighted with, emotional and social significance when we talk about the genocide.
Right.
But I think it's important that we look at how the only document that we have that has some international buy-in is framed, if we're going to talk about what it is, and that's where intent comes back. So just continuing briefly, Article 3, the following acts shall be punishable: genocide, given what we read in Article 2, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. So it's not just the person who pulls the trigger or slits the throat, but it can involve a number of people who may never actually have their hands dirty.
I see. So going into that, you study 20th century Europe. We have, the genocide of the Jewish people in Europe. You also have in the Soviet Union a genocide going on. We can touch into that, but I just wanted to ask you, what do you think are some significant genocides in human history? Maybe some that people aren't well aware of, and also the ones that people, know, like the ones I just said.
Yeah, well, I think the ones that people are aware of, if we're talking about the 20th century, would be the Armenian experience in Turkey during the First World War, the Nazi treatment of the Jews and the Sinti and Roma. And there are a host of other things associated with that we would associate with crimes against humanity that affected the Slavic people of Eastern Europe, for instance, and others. People have pointed to the Soviet-engineered famine that affected mainly the Ukrainians during the 1930s. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia would be another example that people point to, Rwanda, and the violence in Bosnia and also in Kosovo. There are others that scholars point to that I don't know as much about. Guatemala would be one that people have pointed to. I think that's in the 1950s, but I'm not a Latin Americanist, so I can't peg it, as well as others. Whether others might qualify, I would say perhaps they would. It depends on how one's approaching the question. And as an historian, it's difficult for me to feel comfortable saying that something that we don't have enough data on yet would qualify as genocide if we're looking at intent.
I see. Could you explain what happened in Armenia? I have I would say, a type of emotional connection to it because I'm an Oriental Orthodox Christian, a Coptic Orthodox Christian to be specific, and the Armenians are as well. So I don't know if bias is the right word, but I have like an emotional connection to that group. So I'd like to discuss that a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's usually the case that people don't know much about it when we start talking about this.
That's very common.
And it's also been the case that Turkish governments successively since then have refused to acknowledge it as such. And moreover, there wasn't a convention in force yet. So in essence, we're sort of taking a definition that came into existence in 48 to 51 and applying it retroactively. But that being said, there are some aspects to what happened in the Ottoman Empire that I think are meaningful examples of things we might look for in other case studies. Okay. And I think that's also something you're interested in.
Yeah. We'll get into that.
But what happened there was a group of young reformers who were initially rather progressive in their orientation towards politics and society, sought to redirect an old sort of feudal empire into modernity. And they didn't have much success with the existing authorities. So they sort of retooled their approach and built a modernization movement on a Turkish ethnic nationalism, wedded with an understanding of Islam that they had. Yeah. It wasn't primarily religiously driven, but their understanding of Islam was a cultural marker for them. So I wouldn't call them jihadis in any conventional, broad understanding of that. But modernization meant creating a Turkified region that was the Ottoman Empire. But that region included a lot of Coptic Christians, Armenians, Greeks, and others who didn't fit the mold. And the Armenians were numerically the largest population affected, but Greeks were affected. Other Arab Christians were affected in significant numbers. I mean, so I think that we begin to see the state beginning to organize its resources and farming out responsibilities, in this instance from the center outward to the provinces, in order to effect the elimination of the male population, which meant Armenian men wearing the Turkish military uniform, because many Armenians served in the Turkish army, but also priests, village elders, any male figure with a position of authority. And as those, in a patriarchal society, once those people are sort of separated out and dealt with, the rest of the population, children, women, older people, including men, were deported. And deported to be emptied out in the deserts of what is now Syria, where no provisions were made to set up a reserve for them. So people died of hunger, thirst, beatings, all along the way.
What is like the modern day situation of the Armenians?
Well, there's an Armenian state. Right. There had been an Armenian state coming out of the Soviet Union. It was one of the constituent republics of the USSR. You or listeners might well know that the Armenian Republic has been locked in struggle with Azerbaijan over disputed territory pretty much since the fall of the Soviet Union. So there's this massive Armenian diaspora that includes a large population in the United States, but also one in Europe as a result of that conflict. The conflict's going back to World War I, but also the more recent one.
What do you... So, I guess we went through the Armenian Genocide, we talked about a little bit about the other ones that have been significant in history. Have you noticed any causes or similarities that these genocides have to one another that maybe, today as, in modern day, we can recognize and highlight them to prevent it from happening again? Yeah,
I mean, that's a good and really interesting question. And maybe we can sort of take it in two parts.
Okay, let's see.
The first would be like common themes or common
Sure. We'll do the
observations, and then the prevention piece
we
later.
Yes. Okay. Let's do that.
As far as like common themes go, there's a pretty lively scholarly literature about that with historians and sociologists and political scientists and behavioral scientists contributing to it. And what seems to be a common thread is, if we're talking about the sort of more modern era where we can sort of more definitively point to genocide as we've come to understand it, there's an effort in nation building or nation consolidation underway. And we have to make a distinction between the nation and the state. You know, the state are the physical boundaries of a territory, but you know, the nation may be the population, the way to understand itself, cohering as a group, right? It could be ethnically defined, it could be religiously defined, it could be much more pluralistic.
I see.
But it seems like, given the Turkish example we were talking about, but also Germany emerging out of the defeat of World War I, Yugoslavia disintegrating and emerging out of a civil war, nation building seems to be a common understanding. But nation building where there are contested territories, where extremely difficult life circumstances, to quote the psychologist Erwin Staub, weigh very heavily on a population and can be, those concerns can be activated. Gosh, what else could we point to? Maybe you can help me.
Would you say that nationalism in a way?
Well, I think nationalism, insofar as you can activate that nationalism, like in a multi-ethnic society like the United States, nationalism is kind of an abstraction.
Yeah. Okay. So that's
So when you've got a society that has a clearer, more homogeneous understanding of its nationality, which is a fiction in its own right. But, you know, there's at least enough of the myth components to build the idea of nation around.
Right.
If it's perceived that another group, minority,
is inferior.
Inferior, but has undue influence, undue wealth.
Like kind of like a virus in a way.
Yeah, to put it in biological terms or pathological terms. That there's some sort of obstacle to the assertion of mission, destiny, right to something. Those seem to be important factors. But we also see those things having come into play where countries that have settled those issues at home have exported their culture, their economic influence through imperialism. So one could point to instances where there may well have been genocides in Africa into the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and other parts of the world as well.
So we kind of went through like those themes. What about psychologically? What do you think there's a type of propaganda that these governments where the genocide is being committed is giving to their own people? I think a common study of that is Nazi Germany and how quickly people kind of just assimilate it to the way the thought of the Nazis and their worldview. How does that happen? What's this? Is there a common theme in that psychology that there's a tactic that these people use?
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask you some questions too, as someone who studies behavioral science. But let's work through this together a little bit. It seems to me that you have a sort of just world thinking, that there's a way the world should be ordered that isn't.
Yes.
And in order to achieve justice, certain people need to be punished because they stand in the way of the realization of a goal. Yeah. So there becomes almost this understanding that it's a Manichaean struggle between good, which is the in-group, and evil or negativity that's the out-group.
Yeah.
And only one side can survive. So
Right.
a kind of radicalized social Darwinism.
Yes. Okay.
I think that's a factor, but I would argue that it's one thing for there to be, a minister of propaganda chattering away about this.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean people are going to accept it.
Right.
I think there has to be a willingness to accept and embrace these interpretations among a population to get critical mass on your side.
Yeah.
Feelings of having been long suffering, feelings of not having found your place in the sun, and other people are to blame.
Yeah.
It's not as if these people are like the Pied Piper, and as soon as the tune's played, people fall in line.
Right.
So
they're not being hypnotized.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they're not being brainwashed.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
People throw that term brainwashing around, but I mean that's
Yeah.
a distinct, invasive
Yes.
form of behavioral modification.
Yes.
Instead, there's more of this symbiotic relationship, I think.
Yes. I think that's a great way of saying it. I think psychologically what you see, and it's difficult for people to have self-accountability and like inner reflection. So there always is pointing out to something that gets in their way. So it's easy to pin that on another group. It takes that burden off of you, that cross off of you, so to say. And so it's just psychologically easier, and the burden is easier to carry. And also I would say that group thinking and a feeling of community is something that people really look for. And I think in modern day, you see that very much so, where everyone's trying to find a specific community that they identify with. And when they get that sense of community, it gives them purpose and duty and identity. And so if you look at like Nazi Germany, the Nazis were a way for, Germans were really affected by the sanctions and everything done to them as a result of World War I. So I think those people were very vulnerable and looking for, something to just attach themselves to that would bring them up. So I think psychologically, if you look at how the German society was during that time, economically and socially, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, I think were a way for people to take that burden off themselves psychologically, which I think made it easier for them to commit the Nazis to do what they did throughout Germany.
Well, and that's an interesting example. I think you've identified some key things. And I think if we build on that, it can lead us into some of the other things that we might want to talk about in this sort of common catalog of underlying causes, right? In the case of the Nazis, they never won more than, nationwide, never won more than the low 40% of the vote, right? But that entitled them to form a parliament under the rules of, a parliament, the parliamentary system. If you can manufacture enough crises, and manipulate the law to your advantage or pass new laws that empower you, you can deal with internal dissent and also target people who are outside of your sphere of obligation, so to speak, right? And within a year's time, the Nazis were able to imprison leaders of all the other political parties, make those political parties illegal. And all you had left were people who were either Nazi Party members or who engaged in anticipatory compliance. Right? And we'll never know in any of these cases how many people, whether it's Turkey, Germany, Rwanda, Bosnia, were true believers in the violence that they either took part in or heard out the window and closed the drapes, right? But certainly anticipatory compliance enables people who are dead set on committing human rights violations. It enables them to go ahead. There's no opposition. No vocalized opposition.
I think that that's also really interesting is what I've noticed, at least psychologically with people, it's easier for people to think in the sense of yin and yang, like this duality, rather than, expanding this, like, the world it's so complex, and, like there's a gray side to everything, but it's so much easier, and it's so much easier to think if you're just thinking in yin and yang, which is light and dark. Something's good, something's bad, there's no in between. And so what I've noticed when I read some of these horrific acts and, why people weren't saying anything, it's because it was easier just for them to be like, one side's good, one side's bad, there's no gray in between, there's no, complex thinking or introspective thinking at all in this critical thinking, that's the word I was looking for. And, when you get into that mode of just thinking in that sense of duality, I think, that's a dangerous place to be in. Yeah.
And I think in some of the, some or many of the cases one could point to, given that genocides tend to occur in the context of either a war or a civil war.
Yeah.
It's hard to think of it otherwise. Violence doesn't mean war, but it's usually this sort of large-scale violence that where we see it happening. Often, ordinary people are swept up in that violence in ways they don't anticipate, they don't welcome, and they might not even necessarily be subscribe actively to, the hate that a regime is exercising. Thus, they can look at themselves as victims of conflict too. So, it's both that kind of dualism that you're talking about, but also a way of putting your blinders on and just sort of ultimately wallowing or in some cases it's wallowing in your own suffering.
Right.
That's not as sensitive as I should utter my comments. We know how trauma works.
Yes.
And when people experience trauma, the world closes in around them. So it's hard to see what's going on outside of the experience of their own pain.
Right.
So as a bystander who is not actively complicitous in genocide or in human rights abuses, short of genocide, if you've experienced that trauma yourself, you might be less sympathetic to the other side and might rally around the flag with the regime that's committing those acts.
Right.
And that perpetuates the actions for a lack of opposition.
Let's transition to modern day.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a difficult question, but I really want to get a historian's perspective on it. Do you believe that the Israeli government is committing genocide on the Palestinian people from your own expertise?
Yeah, as an historian, that might be a cop-out. As a historian, I have to wait until it's finished before it's not a good look.
Okay.
To put it the least. I mean, maybe I can approach it this way. I think that there are certainly elements in the Israeli government and in the Israeli population, and on the other side in Hamas and sympathizers of Hamas who would gladly see the other side eliminated.
Yes.
I don't think that more broadly the Palestinian people or the Israeli people are genocidal.
I would 100% agree with that. Yeah.
It seems to me that when we look at the bombing of hospitals, the absolutely razing of settled areas, the immense suffering and death. We are talking about war crimes.
Yes.
Yes, for to at a minimum, I would say.
That's you brought up at the beginning, like some things don't qualify as a genocide, but could be a war crime or something along those lines. And right when you said that, the first thing I thought of in my head was, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is what does that qualify as a genocide? Maybe it's too early to tell, or maybe it's just that, you know, it qualifies for not the big one, but these other ones that are also a huge deal, but not to that level of maybe what we see in Armenia or in Nazi Germany and etc.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we also need to be wary against using body counts for our definition of genocide.
That's interesting.
Right? I mean, there isn't a threshold that you cross and you say, now we're in genocide territory. It's you know, there can be massacres without genocide, and they're awful. I mean, no doubt about it. You know, they could be war crimes or crimes against humanity. If they're carried out in the context of a war, that's different than taking it out on, you know, innocent civilians. If your enemy is using your civilian population as a human shield, then it's, you know, then it's sort of war crime territory.
Right.
You know, it's not wanton attacking of civilians just because you can. But yeah, you know, I think it kind of comes back to intent again, Toby.
Yes.
Because we don't know yet what the intent is. There have been meaningful attempts to understand intent more broadly. The late Helen Fine, who's a sociologist, argued that, you know, short of finding the written order from the prime minister or the dictator, the smoking gun document, if you like, we might define intent as discernible, purposeful action. And if you can line up, you know, clear instances of purposeful action that lead to what Article 2 lays out, that for Fine could be a way of understanding genocide.
Yeah.
So I would actually need to see, to know more about what the planning was and what the end game was before I could say any contemporary example, whether it's the Russian attitude towards Ukraine or the Israeli attitude towards Palestine is actually a genocide. I mean, there might be arguments to be made that it is, but I would say in both cases, at the very least, we're looking at war crimes
for both.
And crimes against humanity.
Yes.
Like if you know, I'm looking at the news the other day and I see reports, corroborated reports of the Russians using drones just to hunt down civilians in the city streets. That strikes me as crimes against humanity.
Well, that's another thing that I was, you know, kind of imagining in my head. Well, this is what scares me about modern times, that you don't really need necessarily people to commit a genocide or to commit war crimes anymore. You could send these drones in, and that just makes it easier because you don't have to psychologically or like convince anyone to do it. And a government could just be like, send our drones and our bombers, and you know, we can take out as many people as we like.
Well, there's intent though, right?
There's intent there, and what I'm thinking is that it just makes it easier for, you know, a small group of people to do that, whereas it used to be you would need a small group of people leading a group of army of men to do it. Necessarily, that's not the case anymore, which I think is very scary. I think that's, you know, looking at both the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know, there's a lot of drone warfare going on, and you know, I get it because it saves soldiers' lives. At the same time, you know, I think, you know, it's soulless in a way, but it's you know, I'm not trying to, I don't know what the word is, like
depersonalize it.
Like that I don't want to depersonalize or kind of make like warfare into like this romantic movie in such a way, but you know, there's something about, you know, men like actually fighting each other rather than, and you know, because at the end of that, you know, those men can then teach further generations about that and how to prevent it. Whereas now, you know, if you're doing warfare and using drones like that, the learning experience goes away. And that, again, I don't want to be insensitive towards, you know, soldiers and veterans and such, but I think there is something to that.
I think you're right. In that, maybe I'll put it this way.
Sure.
If what you're saying is with the technology of modern warfare, allow, insofar as it allows for killing with a small group of guys sitting in front of screens, steering drones, or launching missiles, fewer people are actively engaged in the process of death, misery, and destruction.
Yes.
So you're sort of farming that out to a small group of people, which leaves everyone else seemingly detached and unscathed.
Yes.
I think a question we could ask ourselves is, are we complicitous in a society that farms that out if we're shopping via Amazon, comfortably streaming a film, and all that's going on, and it's not touching our lives? Right. Not that it would be better if we were also getting blood splattered on us. It would be horrible.
It's dystopian in a way.
It is dystopian.
Yeah, it's weird to think about.
But the argument could be made that if we sort of push this to a logical extreme, that as taxpayers, even though we're not saying I want X percent of my tax money allocated towards drones or missiles versus healthcare, as taxpayers, one might argue we're complicitous.
Yeah.
But populations are always complicitous. Guys who are men and women who are drawing up the plans, wearing nice clothing, sitting in a room like this, are complicitous, or actually perpetrators are really more the point, as much as the guys who are shooting people, or herding people into gas chambers. If we're talking about the Nazis, what about the people who are driving the trains full of human cargo from collection points to death camps?
Right.
Are they perpetrators? Do we grade perpetrators? It seems like we're tempted to. So it sort of brings us back to this question of, architects, perpetrators, desk murderers, to use a phrase German historians use, versus people who are shaking Zyklon B pellets out of a can into the gas chamber, or shooting people. People designing the blueprints and building gas chambers because it's a nice government contract and they know exactly what it's for.
Right.
They don't know how it'll be used yet, but they know what it is. Right. Either way, whether it's dystopian or whether it's a little bit earlier than that, it sort of challenges us to cast the net much more widely when we think about responsibility, co-responsibility, guilt. That whole continuum.
I mean, it's just it scares me, because then how do you prevent that? Because you talk about all these people, and I'm kind of imagining in my head those specific people, the people who are the contractors for the gas chambers, the guy who's driving the train, the person at the desk, and all these different people, and just I'm trying to imagine them as myself. What if I stand up in that situation? And I'm the gas contractor, the gas chamber contractor. I could end up in one of these gas chamber contractors. You know what I mean? So
it's possible.
It's like the courage that is needed to stand up to that, I think, is mighty. And it makes me think, how do we, as modern day, today, do we prevent something like that from ever happening again?
Yeah. This is where I'm thinking about the question you asked me, how does it weigh on me?
Yeah,
My thinking is we're never going to prevent it.
Right.
But if we're aware of what seemed to be momentum building in certain distressing ways, we need to identify it. And there are two ways we can do it. And this is sort of part B of that earlier question you asked, right? Sort of the cap to the discussion.
Sure.
You have NGOs like Genocide Watch and Human Rights Watch and a variety of others that monitor situations, interview people who are able to leave those areas, try to corroborate reports to get a clear sense of what's happening. And they communicate that information through their websites and other social media. They communicate it with different governments. They communicate it with the United Nations. Mm-hmm. Whether an individual government or collection of governments as a sort of handful of states working together or at the UN level want to act on it becomes a new question. Mm-hmm. Each state, through its State Department or Foreign Ministry, has, many of them have a human rights office, certainly in states that at least nominally take that seriously. So they do the research, they have their own people doing that work, kind of duplicates in a certain way what Genocide Watch might do. Yeah. But you've got another sort of set of eyes on it. Mm-hmm. And the UN has its own Human Rights Commission mm-hmm. with a staff that does this also. So the question then becomes, when information is made available, is it in the interests of, say, the United States, which we know better than other places, right?
Yeah.
To take action.
Yeah.
Quite apart from this being an election year, is it something that the United States is prepared to do?
Right.
Does it involve a strategic partner? Mm-hmm. Does it involve a part of the world that some politicians might say the American people aren't going to care about it, mm-hmm. right? And rationalize it another way. Will there be enough buy-in from a coalition of the willing to seek approval from the UN to take action if the UN can't proceed or won't proceed?
Yeah.
So there are always opportunities to study, observe, report, and urge action. Then it's a question of whether there is the moral courage, the political will, the fortitude to do so, mm-hmm. and whether that'll win out over indifference, calculated self-interest, and cynicism.
Yeah. Let's transition to this. You more broadly study conflicts and civil wars. We are coming up on an election. Who knows the chaos that's coming in the next 2 weeks or so. Does this, I would argue that we are so divided here in the States. Do you see it maybe, a theme or something that you recognize from your studies of conflicts in a country and civil war here in the United States?
Yeah, and of course, a lot of us would say yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that you and I and other observers would say we're moving uncomfortably close to a place where we really need to be super concerned.
Yeah.
As it is, we're concerned enough.
Yeah.
And we don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah.
We hope it's going to turn out peacefully.
Yeah.
And we might conclude that for it to turn out peacefully, there's a certain way it's got to turn out. Like it's got to play out.
Yeah.
So I'm talking as an academic now, not as a citizen.
Okay.
What will interest me is to see how over the years ahead, how long it takes and what forms it takes for the United States to find its way back to some semblance of neighborliness. And some sense of compassion. It wasn't an ideal before. There was never a point when it was like unified and everyone was singing Kumbaya.
Yeah.
But there have been times when we've understood ourselves as less divided.
Yeah.
What will it look like for us to get to that point again? How long will it take?
Yeah. I'm honestly very pessimistic about that perspective because, I just, look at the two sides and to me it's the difference in the two and how their ideologies on what it should, like our country should look like, are so different. Mm-hmm. That's something that scares me. is that I don't know. I want to get your perspective on this. I think we might have been a centimeter away from, a civil war if that bullet hits President Trump where it was intended to go. I would argue that would have caused mass pandemonia in the States.
Yeah, it's scary to think about what could have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just another observation. I'm interested in what you think of this.
Sure.
It would be naive if we said there hasn't always been this underlying current of division.
Yeah.
Every society, pretty much, any time. But this whole this newer culture of trolling your opponent, your adversary, to get clicks and to generate enthusiasm among a group, seems to have weaponized the unsayable, made it evident, made it manifest, and weaponized it.
Sure.
And my concern is when we think about the way any of the previous cases we looked at have evolved, that once that starts to happen, people who are willing to radicalize have a sense that the door has been opened for them.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, something I noted the duality thing, and I think that's something on both sides that you can see. Like, I think something that I have a really hard time grasping when it's said is when Vice President Harris or Secretary Clinton called Trump Hitler, because then I think that goes into that duality conversation of, I think in the modern day Western art culture, we used Hitler as kind of like the symbol for Satan. And so that goes back to that nature of duality, is that Hitler is a representation of Satan. And so when you go out there calling, President Trump, I'm not saying he's perfect, and I know a lot of people dislike them, and they have every right to do so. But I think to call him Hitler, I think that gives that people, this sense of doom and can radicalize them in that way. And in the same way, when Trump is going out there claiming, he said a number of different things that, could also people look at Vice President Harris as they're Satan. So I think that's something really scary, is that there has to be, you want to politically attack your opponent. I mean, that's the nature of politics. It's totally fine. But when you're comparing one another, to the worst of the worst, and, people are going to follow that and get into that because, like I said, I think what both sides have done a great job is, if you're a Kamala Harris supporter, if you're a Donald Trump supporter, it gives you that sense of community. And, to be more in that community, you're going to radicalize yourself and go into that dualistic thinking perspective. And I think that is what's dangerous. And that's something I've noticed here in this election cycle, is that, we're getting into that point now where each side is looking at the other as, this Satan type figure. And when the other candidate doesn't win, if your candidate doesn't win and you're radicalized, that's going to cause, you to panic and, mass pandemonium in the States. And I think that is what's difficult, where it didn't used to be like that. You talked about uniting, I think 9/11 was something, that as tragic as an event that was something that really united the country. So I think it would, and I would try to imagine, not that I want it to happen, because I don't, something like that happens in today's, United States, I feel like it wouldn't be a uniting thing. It would just be one side blaming the other side,
Yeah, and I think that, and I in the spirit that you do your podcast, to open up discussions about challenging topics, we need to get to a point where more people are willing to do that.
Yes.
Informally or formally.
Yeah, I agree.
Without demonizing the other side, without looking to score points, without turning a conversation into a world wrestling showdown.
Yeah. Like,
right?
my point is right.
Yeah.
We don't need it. Yeah.
And to get away from sort of leading with the "I believe in my opinion,"
Sure.
but a more moderate, it seems to me
you have to be
I
open
assess,
to hearing the other. Something that I said in my introduction video is that I want my opinions and my perspective and my values to be challenged, and that's a good thing. Like, I welcome being wrong, because if I was wrong and someone explains to me that I'm wrong, that means I'm smarter than I was 5 minutes ago. So I think what people are doing is they're getting into their own like little tunnels. Mm-hmm. They're digging themselves in, and like they don't want to, there's a saying, ignorance is bliss. And I think, a lot of people would much rather be ignorant and like have their own perspectives and surround themselves with people with their own perspectives than expand, their perspectives and their way of thinking, because it's just easier to live life that way. And, that's, something that I've never conceptually grasped, and I know it's a big reason why I started doing what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So I think that is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed, absolutely. Yeah.
But, yeah, I guess, I don't know, I think the next coming days will be very interesting. What do you, through your study of 20th century Europe, is there like anything, that surprised you, like when you're going through that you've been doing this forever, and I'm sure you've seen everything, but when you were like, could you remember a moment where you were studying and just be like, because 20th century Europe is a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, there were plenty of moments when I've been, in an archive and I'm looking through stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that is extraordinary. But maybe more to, instead of talking about one point, a trend, I just finished a book manuscript where I was looking at rebuilding a democratic political culture in Vienna right after World War II. Mm. And that was a city that had been left of center and kind of an international model for progressive politics in Europeans' eyes, but it also went fervently Nazi once the Nazis came in.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons we can't get into here.
Yeah.
But what interested me and sort of, did give me those oh my moments was looking at what former Nazis said about why they did what they did, how they rationalized what they did, and understood themselves as victims again.
Yes.
They rationalized what they did as having been victims of the Nazis, having been misled.
Yes.
Then they were victims when the Allies occupied the city, and Vienna was occupied by all four powers, just like Berlin was.
Right.
And then they were victimized by the new government for being marginalized under denazification law. Mm-hmm. And this sort of litany of hand-wringing was fascinating.
Yes.
And in some cases, it just seemed some people were genuinely nasty when you read the corroborating reports about them. But in other instances, there were people who were just, saying like, I'd been unemployed through the Great Depression. This was an opportunity. I had this job. I had to join the party, or I was told I would keep my job if I joined the party. I did. I never used it to disadvantage or harm anyone. Right. And often there were corroborating reports that, this person actually never did, mistreat anyone or denounce anyone or anything. The person was just a Nazi in name only. But according to the law, that person had to sit out for a few years until there was an amnesty. And I'm not making a plea that all those people, we should cry tears for all those people, but it is an interesting case.
It's very interesting. As a historian, I want to ask you this question. I guess a series of questions, and you can take it wherever you want. How important do you think historians are like how significant do you think they play a role in, our society? And what is a good historian from a bad historian? Like I've seen this conversation a lot where it's like, this is a historian that maybe has his own bias, and that's not someone you should read a book or listen to a podcast about. And his perspective, here's a better one. So how can someone who is fascinated with history and wants to learn decipher between which historian he trusts?
Yeah. I mean, historians actually have to go into the archives and they have to look at the sources.
Yeah.
It's kind of like mining for gold. You can spend a lot of time panning, looking for nuggets.
Right.
And you always walk away having read far more than you're ever going to really be able to use. So I think being an historian is about being patient. It's about being empathetic but critical as you're looking at documents, whether they're diaries or government reports or, trying to get to the human story behind statistics. But I think that, the first of all, the historians you would trust are people who've actually done that work. And then look at who they're reading. This is what I do because it's my profession.
Right.
I'm really interested in their bibliographies. I want to know who they read. I want to know who they're citing. And even if one doesn't agree with a number of the people they've cited, if these are people who've been part of a discussion and had their interpretations vetted by a jury of their peers, and they're buffeted in that process, but they're still making the argument, and there's still something about it that you can point to as being interesting. That's the person ultimately who I would read or who I'd listen to, whether I agree with them or not. Whether I'm interested in the questions they're asking or less interested. Those are the ones I would pay attention to.
I see. Is there a certain topic currently that you're finding very fascinating in your work and research?
Well, like I said, I just finished a book manuscript, and I'm waiting to hear from the press about it. But I'm already sort of thinking ahead to the next project. I don't know how interesting people are going to find it, but I'm interested in the experience of work. And I think I'd like to sort of return to this urban history frame. And I've been working in Vienna, and I've got a nice network there, and I know the sources and all, so I might stay there. But I'm kind of interested in the experience of work as the monarchy transitioned to the Republic after World War I, how the Republic turned into a fascist state. Then the fascist state became a Nazi state, and then the Nazi state became a republic again, all over 25 years' time.
That's crazy to think about.
I'm interested in people's experience of work, and maybe I'll just look at the public sector in the city. Municipal employees, streetcar drivers, other people who, rely. Their work was essential for the functioning of a vibrant public space.
Right.
And what it was like under each of those different regimes and through regime change. In some cases, people would have been disadvantaged if they didn't belong to the new
Ingrid.
And what was that like?
At
each moment.
I find that fascinating personally. I think that's those inner details of that stuff. I think that's when you're what makes a good movie is like when the movies get those inner details right. I think that's the same way with history. Like those things are important, and I find them very fascinating because when you just look from like a wider perspective, you just see the bad guys and the good guys. But what about the average day, everyday Joe in those situations? What's happening? How does this because that's where the change and the effect really happens. It's the everyday Joes. It's not the ones at the top because they're at the top. But so I find them very interesting. But
it's tough with the sources. I mean, you want to get a representative sample of people. And to be able to argue that this was the range of experience, with credibility. And I think I agree with you entirely. It's that everyday life experience that gives us a sense for how most people lived
Yeah.
their normal lives despite moments of terror, moments of pleasure, moments of anxiety and doubt.
I have a fun question for you. So, as a historian, if you're going to watch a movie about some specific, like, historical conflict or plot, do you find yourself enjoying those movies less because you're like, oh, that's not actually what happened. That's not realistic.
No, I wouldn't say I enjoy them less. I still enjoy them plenty, but if there's something that you either know really wasn't the case, or you think, that can't have been right.
Throws you off.
Yeah.
Is there one that you like, a specific movie that you could think of maybe that did that?
Oh, I mean, any of these Tarantino films about World War II. I mean, they're fun, but they're just over the top crazy. And he probably would say the same.
Yeah. Do you think there's one that you thought they actually did a really good job with it?
If we're staying in the theme of World War II, I think
Yeah.
Band of Brothers is incredible.
Yeah.
It was done. They took some liberties, with the story for the economy of storytelling.
Right.
And they didn't always, from what I understand, they didn't always do justice to some of the storylines of some of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, they did their research and they recreated it, and they had a budget, and they did an incredible series.
Yeah. I think that's good.
Yeah.
Dr. Berg, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
Watching this episode of the Toby Talks podcast. Thank you to Dr. Mathew Berg for his time. I had a great time in that conversation. If you would, before you click off this video, hit the like and subscription button. I put a lot of hours into this, and I would be eternally grateful for you if you did that. But yeah, I have a lot of good episodes coming up in the future, and I can't wait to share them with you guys. So I'll see you guys then. Peace.